On a summer night in Houston, the city moved with quiet familiarity. Traffic lights blinked in their endless rhythm. Neon signs buzzed gently above empty storefronts. The sidewalks were empty, save for the hum of distant cars and the glow of porch lights casting shadows across weathered driveways. It was the kind of night that felt ordinary, even forgettable, marked by stillness rather than sound. Inside a modest single-story home tucked into the edge of a forgotten block, a man sat alone. The room around him was dim and quiet. The air was thick with the scent of stale bourbon. Half-empty glasses lined the coffee table like forgotten confessions, and the bottle beside him stood as a monument to all the nights that had come before this one. The television flickered in the background, muted and meaningless. He had stopped listening hours ago. For years, this man had lived beneath the surface of suspicion. His life was deliberately uneventful. He moved from one city to the next without attracting attention. He worked unremarkable jobs, gave polite smiles, and kept his answers short. He blended into sidewalks and bus stops. No one ever stopped to ask where he had come from or why he kept moving. And that was exactly how he had planned it. He had always known how to disappear without vanishing. But guilt is a patient thing. It grows in the silence. It waits in the quiet moments between drinks and dreams. It festers when there is no one left to lie to except yourself. And on this night, when the weight of the past finally grew too heavy, he reached for something more than a drink. He reached for the phone. The voice that spoke to the emergency operator was slow and uneven. It sounded like someone remembering something rather than confessing. It carried none of the chaos one might expect. Instead, it was the dull thud of truth falling from a mouth that had held it shut for far too long. The words were clear, heavy, and irreversible. A quiet confession that cracked the surface of a life built entirely on lies. The call lasted just over 90 seconds. It was not dramatic. There was no shouting, no tears, just the steady unfolding of something monstrous. By the time officers arrived at the address tied to the number, the neighborhood was still asleep. The house stood in silence, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness. The door was unlocked. The lights inside were dim. And there, seated in the living room, the man was waiting. He had not run. He had not hidden. He sat slouched in a recliner, his shoulders slumped, his face slack with the weight of something that had finally broken loose. There was no resistance. No fight. Just a nod. A sentence. And silence. He admitted what no one had suspected. He named the women. He accepted the weight of what he had done. But not with remorse. It was not grief that filled the room. It was fatigue. A slow unraveling of a man who had held his breath for too long. That night marked the beginning of something the world didn't know it had been missing. A story buried beneath years of silence had finally surfaced. 3 women, once treated as question marks, had names once more. Their absences had been misread, their fates misunderstood. But now, the truth had arrived, not with sirens or spotlights, but with a whisper into a phone and the quiet collapse of a man who could no longer hold it all inside. By morning, the city was still moving, but the world had changed. Zariah Whitmore had always been a woman of rhythm and responsibility. She did not vanish. She did not make sudden choices or leave things unfinished. Her life was built on certainty, on quiet structure and careful movement. After more than 30 years as a nurse, she had developed a kind of steadiness that anchored those around her. In hospitals crowded with urgency and grief, Zariah had been the calm in the storm. She knew how to manage chaos without ever allowing it to enter her own life. Friends saw her as dependable. Colleagues leaned on her during moments of crisis. Patients remembered her not just for her care, but for her presence, the quiet way she sat beside them, the gentle steadiness in her voice. She was deliberate, focused, and resilient. So when she did not return home one July afternoon, the worry arrived quickly but quietly, like something out of place in an otherwise ordered world. It had been a warm summer morning, the kind that pulled people outdoors and invited them to forget, if only for a few hours, the weight of daily life. Zariah had decided to hike. It was something she did often. Coyote Hills Regional Park was familiar terrain. The trails wound through hills and dense brush, offering a kind of solitude she rarely found elsewhere. It was a place where she could think clearly, away from the sound of hospital monitors and the fluorescent white of long shifts. She left before sunrise, telling only her husband. She was never seen again. As the hours passed and the sun crept overhead, what started as routine slowly became cause for concern. Calls went unanswered. Her car remained parked where she had left it, and by nightfall, her husband contacted the authorities. He explained her plan. He said she was experienced. He said she should have returned hours ago. Search teams arrived before midnight. Canines moved through the dense undergrowth. Helicopters swept low over the hills, casting beams of light across ravines and ridgelines. Volunteers combed through trails, shouting her name. But the land gave nothing back. It held its silence like a secret. There was no trace of a fall, no trail of belongings, no torn fabric or disturbed earth. The ground beneath Coyote Hills remained untouched, as if Soraya had never walked it at all. The theories came quickly, each one plausible enough to quiet the deeper questions. She may have taken a wrong turn. The heat may have disoriented her. There could have been an animal, a moment of imbalance, a sudden drop into one of the steep, hidden gorges. These were tragedies people could accept. Accidents that made sense of a senseless absence. Her husband stood before cameras with practiced grief. He answered questions with calm precision, his voice never trembling, his expressions just measured enough to convince. He spoke of her strength. He asked the public to come forward if they saw anything. He thanked the search teams for their effort. No one noticed the gaps in his mourning. No one questioned the ease with which he recited his timeline. He looked like a man in pain, and that was enough. Eventually, the search ended. There were no leads, no signs of foul play, no new information. Soraya's file was quietly closed. Her name was removed from active bulletins and folded into a growing archive of those who had disappeared without resolution. Her case was labeled accidental. A woman who had wandered into the wild and simply never come back. A memorial was held. It was small, intimate. Her colleagues shared stories. Her neighbors left flowers. Her husband accepted condolences with the kind of poise that suggested he had come to terms with loss. But he had not lost her. He had taken her. At the time, no one knew. The world believed the story he had told. But behind the image of sorrow stood something calculated. Her disappearance had not been an accident. It had been orchestrated, hidden beneath layers of trust and routine. Soraya was not the first. And tragically, she would not be the last. Years passed without answers. Her name faded from conversation, reappearing only in the quiet corners of those who had once known her. Her face remained on aging flyers and the back pages of case review binders. Her story remained unfinished. But stories do not stay buried forever. In the haze of a late-night confession made in a living room miles away, her name was spoken again. Pulled back from obscurity and given life by the very man who had tried to erase her. This time, Soraya would not be remembered for her absence. She would be known as the first in a sequence far more sinister. The silence surrounding her was about to shatter. Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest tragedies. Names fade. Headlines disappear. Posters are quietly taken down from telephone poles and bulletin boards, no longer freshly printed but sun-bleached and curling at the edges. Soraya Whitmore became one of those names. Her disappearance lingered in the hearts of those closest to her, but to the wider world, she slipped into the silence reserved for the missing. A brief obituary, a modest memorial, and then nothing. Her absence was treated as private sorrow, not public suspicion. But Soraya had never been the only one. Long before the day she walked into Coyote Hills and never returned, Malachi Reading had already practiced the art of making people vanish. And long before he sat slumped in a Houston living room, half drowned in alcohol and regret, he had already tested the boundaries of erasure. Years earlier, in Ohio, the first name had quietly disappeared from the living world. Amira Lofton was not someone who disappeared easily. She was a financial analyst, a meticulous woman who lived by structure. Her days were mapped in spreadsheets, her routines carefully managed. Her friends were few, but loyal. She kept her world small, intentional, protected. When she met Malachi, some were surprised. He arrived without fanfare, slipped into her life like a bookmark, unexpected but fitting. He presented himself with quiet warmth, the kind that made people feel safe. Within a year, they were married. Within another, she was gone. Her absence made few ripples. She had no close family nearby. The story arrived fully formed, a troubled marriage, a note in her handwriting, a claim that she needed space. According to Malachi, she packed a few bags and left in the middle of the night. No one saw her leave. No one heard from her again. The police filed a report. The case sat in a drawer. There were no bruises, no blood, no reason to push further. And so, the world moved on. Years later, in Georgia, it happened again. Celeste Donahue was no more predictable than Amira, but she was just as independent. A successful real estate broker with a schedule full of closings and contract negotiations, she lived by instinct and intuition. Her lifestyle was fast, ambitious, and solitary. She prided herself on needing no one. But Malachi found a way in.
To her, he was a calm contrast.
A quiet space in a loud world. A partner who offered the kind of grounded presence she hadn't known she craved. She told a friend that she was finally ready to share her life. But within a year of their marriage, she too was gone. There was no struggle. No break-in. No visible alarm. Just silence. Her car was found weeks later in the long-term parking section of an airport. Her keys were never recovered. Her phone was never used again. Malachi explained that she had left during an argument, that she needed time, that this was simply who she was. The police asked questions, but with no evidence of foul play, no body, and no leads, they had little to pursue. Celeste's friends raised concerns. They pushed. They insisted she would never walk away without a word. But Malachi remained consistent.
Calm.
Cooperative. Just like before. And just like before, the questions dissolved into the kind of silence that grows when nothing can be proven. 3 women. 3 disappearances. 3 lives carefully erased without noise or violence, only a deep and calculated absence. Each story, taken alone, seemed tragic but explainable. But together, they revealed something far more intentional. There were patterns hidden beneath the grief. Each woman had been accomplished, self-sufficient, and increasingly isolated. Each had taken out a life insurance policy in the early stages of her marriage. And in every case, the sole beneficiary was Malachi Reading. The documents were real. The signatures were authentic. The policies were perfectly timed. After each woman disappeared, money followed. Not vast sums, but enough. Enough to relocate. Enough to disappear again. Enough to start over without raising alarms. The financial trail was faint, but deliberate. Transfers across multiple accounts, quiet withdrawals, no sudden spikes. There was just enough restraint to stay under the radar. For a long time it worked. Then came the night he picked up the phone. In less than 2 minutes, Malachi did what no investigator had ever managed. He connected the dots. He named the women. And in doing so, he turned tragedies into a timeline.
Soraya.
Celeste. Amira. They were no longer isolated disappearances. They were pieces of a larger architecture. A sequence.
A design.
Proof of a man who did not act out of impulse or emotion, but out of calculation. He had not lost control. He had perfected it. His grief had been staged. His sorrow rehearsed. He had performed loss with the precision of a man who had spent years preparing for questions he hoped would never come. But now the questions had arrived, and the pattern, once invisible, had become impossible to ignore. Long before the headlines. Long before the trial. Long before the bodies were found and the name Malachi Reading became synonymous with manipulation and murder, he was just a man. He held doors open for strangers. He returned borrowed tools. He offered quiet nods at the mailbox and made small talk in grocery store lines. There was nothing in his presence that demanded attention. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Malachi Reading's greatest weapon was not aggression. It was invisibility. He blended into every environment with practiced subtlety. Never too loud. Never too bold. He was calm, polite, the kind of man who remembered names and noticed when someone had gotten a haircut. He knew how to make people feel seen, especially the women he chose. He didn't hunt in darkness. He didn't strike without knowing. He studied. He observed women the way a predator observes the rhythm of prey. Patiently, silently, waiting to understand not their weaknesses but their needs. The women he chose were not helpless. They were the opposite. They were educated, self-sufficient, disciplined. They had carved out lives that didn't rely on anyone else. But independence has its blind spots. In solitude, even strength can be mistaken for peace. These women were alone by circumstance or by choice. They had buried themselves in careers, built walls around themselves, focused on discipline and structure while ignoring the slow ache of emotional neglect. Many had gone years without companionship. And when someone like Malachi arrived, someone who listened more than he spoke, who didn't interrupt, who remembered small details and offered steady support, it felt like fate, not danger. He didn't arrive with fireworks. He arrived with understanding. Malachi offered what the world often forgot to give them: validation. He didn't challenge them. He didn't compete with their success. He framed himself as a foundation. The kind of man who let them keep their independence, but made them feel like they didn't have to carry everything alone. He gave them attention where others gave them expectations. And in time, they began to lean on him. That was the first step. The manipulation did not come with warnings. It came with subtle shifts. Instead of demanding they cut off friends or distance themselves from family, he planted suggestions. Questions carefully timed. Did that friend really have your best interest at heart? Was that sister too critical of your choices? Did that colleague overstep too often? He never forbade. He discouraged. He made calls less frequent by making visits less comfortable. He introduced inconvenience, not control. Not yet. And because he never raised his voice or drew hard lines, the women never saw the isolation forming. It felt like the natural result of intimacy, of compromise, of prioritizing a relationship. Soon, the outer world faded. Friends stopped calling. Family visits grew rare. The only constant presence in their lives became Malachi. Then came the next layer: financial entanglement. He never forced his way into their accounts. He framed it as responsibility, as love, as good planning. Life insurance policies were suggested with logic.
It was practical, he said.
It was what married couples do. A safety net, just in case. He didn't ask for control. He asked for trust. And each time they gave it, months would pass. Sometimes longer. He never rushed. Malachi was deliberate, measured. He waited until he knew the narrative would hold. When he finally acted, it was not in rage or panic. It was not heat-of-the-moment violence. It was cold calculation. The scenes were constructed, the exits planned, the evidence neutralized. Each disappearance was carefully engineered to leave behind just enough confusion, just enough sorrow, just enough doubt to keep suspicion at bay. He crafted stories that sounded familiar. She left. She was overwhelmed. She needed space. There were no signs of foul play. No blood. No broken windows. Just silence, arranged to look accidental. By the time authorities were contacted, Malachi already had answers. He played the role of the bewildered husband with precision. He used language like worried and shocked. He asked the right questions. He expressed concern with the weariness of a man who had not slept in days. Grief became a script. He performed it flawlessly. And when the dust settled, he moved on. He left the state, changed his number, started a new chapter in a new place. The old story was never erased, just buried under layers of polite detachment and subtle misdirection. In every new city, he became someone else. But the mask stayed the same. He was the man shaped by loss. The one who carried scars too deep to talk about. The one who spoke about love as if it had once saved him and then destroyed him. It made people curious, but not suspicious. He kept his past vague enough to be tragic and specific enough to be believed. What no one saw was the architecture behind it all. Control was the blueprint. Not affection. Not companionship. Certainly not grief. Malachi didn't crave chaos. He wanted predictability. He wanted to orchestrate lives so completely that when he took them away, no one would know where to start looking. He killed not in the shadows, but in silence. He dismantled lives with patience. He created absence that looked like choice. And he walked away, not hurried, but careful. Always ready to play the part again, if needed. It wasn't until he sat slouched in a dim bar, surrounded by liquor and fading control, that the mask cracked. When his voice finally let slip the names he had kept hidden. When the grief he had faked so perfectly for others came back in the form of truth he could no longer hold. For years, people had seen a grieving husband, a man unlucky in love, a quiet man surrounded by tragedy. But now, they finally saw what had always been underneath. A predator who weaponized trust. A manipulator who perfected the illusion of love. A killer who didn't need a knife, only time. The courtroom was empty now. The cameras had gone. The reporters had filed their stories and moved on to other headlines. The verdict had been read. The sentence handed down. Malachi Reading had been led from the room in chains, his posture no longer upright, his face no longer unreadable. There was no longer any need to pretend. The truth had stripped him bare. But the story did not end with a conviction. It lived in what remained after the echoes of justice had quieted. Amira Lofton, Celeste Donahue, Soraya Whitmore. Their names had once lived only in the margins, in cold case files, in unanswered voicemails, in fading photographs posted on bulletin boards and utility poles. They had been reduced to whispers, to questions without resolution, to the ache that follows absence. But now, their stories had returned. Not as fragments, but as full and human truths. They were no longer just the victims of a man who had perfected control. They were no longer statistics or headlines. They were daughters, sisters, friends, professionals, women whose lives had depth, purpose, and momentum. They had entered marriages with trust. They had believed in love. They had opened their doors and their hearts to someone who saw vulnerability as an opportunity. Each one had been strong in her own way. Each had built a life marked by independence, ambition, and resilience. But strength does not protect against manipulation. Intelligence does not always recognize malice when it comes wrapped in warmth. What Malachi offered them was never love. It was obedience, dressed in affection. It was control disguised as care. They died not because they failed to see the danger. They died because they believed in someone who made it easy not to look. The pattern of their deaths revealed more than just the acts of a single man. It exposed the systems that failed them. It showed the ease with which silence can be mistaken for peace. That a missing woman without visible bruises is too often written off as someone who left willingly. That absence, when dressed in normalcy, is far too easy to dismiss. Files were closed too quickly. Questions were not asked loudly enough. Stories that should have raised alarms were instead quietly accepted. A forged email here, a vague explanation there, and suddenly, a life disappears without anyone demanding a second look. Malachi did not hide in the shadows. He existed in plain sight. He smiled at neighbors. He answered questions politely. He stood beside grieving families with practiced sorrow. And because he looked ordinary, people believed he was. That is the part of the story that lingers longest. Because the danger was never just in the acts themselves. It was in the silence that surrounded them. The silence that protected him. The silence that allowed the distance to grow between these women and the people who loved them. The silence that disguised murder as misfortune. It is tempting to ask how he got away with it for so long. The harder question is why no one looked closer sooner. Why no one questioned the patterns? Why no one noticed that insurance policies followed every marriage and death followed every policy? Why departures were accepted without bodies? Why grief from a man with no tears was enough to close a case. Evil rarely reveals itself through chaos. It smiles. It shakes hands. It remembers anniversaries. It uses charm as a shield and kindness as camouflage. It passes unnoticed unless someone is willing to question the story, to challenge the calm, to follow the silence and ask what it might be hiding. Malachi Reading will never walk free again. But the end of his story is not the lesson. The lesson lives in vigilance. It lives in paying attention when someone pulls away, in noticing when a life changes course without reason, in refusing to accept that someone simply disappeared without asking who benefits from their absence. It lives in remembering that strength and independence do not make a person immune to control, that anyone can be vulnerable to someone who makes it easy to trust the wrong things.
Soraya,
Celeste, Amira. Their stories were nearly stolen, but not entirely. In the end, they were remembered not just as victims, but as women whose lives meant something. Women whose voices, though once silenced, became louder than the man who tried to erase them. Their truth did not vanish. It survived. And now it belongs to all of us.